Thank you for joining us, everybody. Emily, do you want to introduce yourself? And
Sure.
Okay, go for it.
Sure, I'll be glad to do that. I'm Emily Bonds Davey. I'm a visiting professor at Cumberland School of Law, where I teach contracts and also direct the externship program. But I'm also a mediator and very interested in empathy and how it works with dispute resolution. Lynn?
All right. And I am Lynn Hogewood. I serve as the Director of Academic Support here at Cumberland and teach a couple of different things. Been here since 2007 and observed and grown a lot in my own empathy for students and for lawyering as well. So I am not a mediator, but I am a studier and researcher of empathy and really its role in learning, but how that helps us in lawyering as well. So I will get started, and Emily, I'll let you introduce Virginia and Francis when we get to that part.
Sure.
Awesome. Okay. So you're here today to learn a little bit about empathy and why it's important in mediation. So I'm going to set the stage for you about what empathy is and why it's necessary and how we can lean into it in our law practices. And then Emily will take it from there to really talk about it in terms of being a mediator or in mediation itself. So empathy. There's many definitions out there about what it is. On your screen, the Jeff Cochran book from Shapiro Negotiations, he talks about it being in relationship with others and how we recognize the different feelings that people go through when we're communicating with them. Some other definitions can be empathy is about feeling the feelings of others. I don't think it's quite that deep. I do think it's somewhere lands between sympathy and compassion, and sympathy being feeling sorry for someone without really understanding or connecting to why they feel that way. You might have care for them, but you can't necessarily experience things in the same way. It's like a little bit of a pat on the back, but at an arm's length away. And then compassion really takes empathy to the next step, takes sympathy as well to the next step as action steps of really feeling a little bit further and providing action along the way. So it's connected to the feelings of the other, maybe giving them a hug and then taking them by the hand to walk with them the rest of the way. Empathy stands a little bit between. It's a place where you can understand what they're going through, really try to take on the perspective that they might have. It's like a big hug, maybe wrapping someone up in a hug with absorbing some of their feelings, believing them about what they're experiencing and the pain that they might have, even though you might not have been there yourself. But it might not go as far as walking with them through the rest of the way. It's just, hey, I see you, I recognize what's going on here for you, and I honor that, and how can I help? But it might still leave some distance between. So most empaths actually do show compassion because that's how the layers of emotions tend to work. I am going to change screens and show, it's a classic example. Brene Brown writes a lot about vulnerability and empathy. And she has this video here. I'm going to share with you guys a new screen. And hopefully if it needs the volume up, someone please let me know.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right, I will change my share again here and give you some information about the components of empathy and what empathy can show up as. I love this quote by Albert Einstein. I think it's from him. I kind of tried to do my background to make sure, but that it's patiently and sincerely seeing the world through the other person's eyes. It's not learned in school, it's cultivated over a lifetime. So it does have deep roots, however, in the makeup of our brains. And neuroscience is now supporting some of the emotions that we've always felt. It's kind of evidence is coming together for reasons that we feel different things. So with cognitive empathy, this is where simply knowing how another person feels and what they might be thinking is this cognitive empathy. Daniel Goleman writes a lot about this through his book, Emotional Intelligence. He's a renowned psychologist and wrote this book back as far back as 95, actually. But it's really sometimes called just this perspective taking for cognitive empathy. It's concerned with thought, understanding, intellect. It can help in negotiations, motivating other people, understanding diverse viewpoints, even ideal in a virtual meeting scenario, this cognitive type of empathy. The pitfalls, though, it can seem a little bit disconnected from or ignoring the deeper emotions that people might experience, especially when we come from different backgrounds. It doesn't necessarily put you in another person's shoes in the feeling sort of sense. Then there is this affective or emotional empathy. With affective empathy, you're really experiencing those sensations. I was just in New York over the weekend, actually, with my daughter's high school. They sang at Carnegie Hall. That was a very exciting moment. But one of the things we did was go to the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And the emotional empathy that I recognized in myself there was higher than I expected. It was higher in these 16 and 17-year-olds than I would have expected, and frankly was glad to see. So that was a compassionate type of empathy where you feel physically along with other people's emotions. It's concerned with that physical sensation when you might have the sinking feeling, a lump in your throat, tears might be shed. It does help with your close interpersonal relationships in careers like coaching, teaching, marketing, management, and HR. Marketing gurus know how to get me to cry in commercials. So somebody's working with empathy in those types of meetings. This is a behavioral type of component of empathy that's integrated with our brains and an understanding of others' emotions where we start to feel it a little bit deeper. There's another layer to this compassionate empathy where Daniel Goleman describes this as the kind of empathy we not only understand a person's type of predicament and feel with them, but are spontaneously moved to help if there's some sort of need. This does involve intellect, emotion, and action. It's that bridge between actually feeling the emotions or being able to understand what someone's going through to taking the action step. And the benefit here is it really considers the person as a whole. In the example from the Brene Brown video, when the animal goes down into the hole with the other one and really recognizes you're not alone, but then if they were to start to take the steps of how can I help you? How can we climb out of this ladder together to get you into a safer space? That would be more of the compassionate empathy. So those are the different layers of empathy. And then how do we cultivate it? One of the best ways to cultivate empathy is really just a recognition of self. That self-awareness and self-reflection and monitoring how we exist in the world or show up for others can be just that, this awareness. And of course, knowing that our own story, our own backgrounds, my background's going to look different from probably the other 65-ish people on this Zoom call. We're all so very different, and honoring that we have a story that looks different than others is where self-awareness can help us. It can also help us with identifying our own emotions. Brene Brown is actually out with a new book called Atlas of the Heart that goes through and really defines very succinctly, very fine-tuned different emotions, and recognizing that the words we use to describe our emotions affects how we actually evolve in our emotional development and into the ways that we act and react. With this self-reflection too comes that layer of body language, being aware of exactly how we present ourselves in certain scenario. I was talking to a student earlier and they were asking me about, they have an interview this afternoon at 2. And so they were asking me about, I'm not in the right outfit and I need to do these things and run home. And I said, first of all, you just need to take a deep breath just to get yourself centered, because right now you're going to present like a crazy person. So come together and get your thoughts together, take a deep breath, watch for your body language, because if you just roll into that interview all in a frenzy, that will be noticeable. So just talking about body language, that comes from self-awareness. Of course, listening skills, and my next slide I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. Listening empathetically really requires active listening. This is where I leaned into empathy because as a learner, for a law student, they need to be active listeners. Much like you involved in negotiations and mediations, need to be active, engaged listeners, and empathy plays a role in that. Being open and interested in what the party is saying, relaxing, opening up the conversation in a way that someone feels like they can share anything would probably be a good lawyering skill. Whether it's a deposition or in negotiation. Also, finding common ground with empathy, when we can see that we are more alike than we are different, can help. It can help maneuver the relationship, the negotiation, all of those things. And so first, by becoming more self-aware, we can recognize our own emotions, we can see how we demonstrate them. Then by listening intently and actively, we can begin to understand how other people show up. And in those places that they show up, we can also come to that common ground. We may disagree on the law or some sort of remedy to a particular problem, but we can start with some sort of common ground. And I think the example that Virginia and Francis will give moves into that, about finding that common ground that leads to some resolution in the legal problem. With empathy and active listening skills. Empathetic listening is actually active listening, but it does take it a little bit further, because it does provide active listening is you're completely engaged and that sort of thing. But empathetic listening really is about taking the perspective of the others and maybe trying to get to know their experience and their background that brings them to this place that they're in at the moment. These are some highlights on this slide for empathetic listening. Keeping your opinions to yourself. I know that I do that even with my body language. Frankly, that's why I would be a terrible trial lawyer, is because my facial expressions would show up entirely too much. I tend to head nod. I would not be good at that. So, and I know that about myself. So not talking while the other person is talking is also, of course, empathetic and active listening. A lot of times we start to create our reply or of what we want to say before the person is finished talking. That's totally human nature. So this empathetic listening really does take practice. Making good eye contact, looking directly at the person you're talking to is key. I know this is something I say to the students is like, if you're, especially those, because they use so many laptops and are typing their notes. And I often ask, well, did you look your professor in the eye today? And they're like, oh, I don't think I did. And I think that's an important part that they should do in learning, just listening to their professor and really paying attention there. Pausing where required. It is okay when you're listening intently to say, hey, wait a minute. I'm catching up with what you've said right here. I'm starting to notice some things. So can we pause just a second? Let me take a deep breath so that you can come back and be a better listener after that 3-second pause. It doesn't take long. It's just long enough so that you can get your focus back. Then when the other person stops talking, trying to paraphrase the words. I think that most good mediators do that. Like, this is what I heard you say. This is what I heard you say. And that's where that common ground can come together. With the empathetic listening, though, is really understanding the perspective. Listening to really fully understand where they've been, a lot of their background. I know as an educator, that's often something that I'm doing with the students that come into this Cumberland building, is to be able to think, okay, your experience as a graduate of say Shades Valley High School, which is where I graduated from, might be different from somebody that graduated from Mountain Brook High School, just to understand where their perspectives might be. Then accepting the words. I know a lot of times we want to take things at face value, as we should. Like, if you use a word, we think you're intentional with that word choice. But sometimes the paraphrasing can help make sure that you've understood what the person intended, especially in the legal community, because I think people want to sound more knowledgeable about the law than they might be. For first-year law students, I'll often say, you just need to take the word negligent out of your phrasing, because you don't know what it means, and now you're going to misuse it. So you can't just go call everything, oh, she was so negligent when she did that. You can't do that because there are stakes here. You can't talk about guilt and liability the same way. So you have to understand where people are coming from with their word choice. That's why paraphrasing can really be helpful with empathetic listening. Paying attention to that nonverbal communication. This can be helpful when you are self-aware about your own nonverbal communication, when you have the sighs, when you have when you disagree with what someone says, when you eye roll, when you disengage, if you will. When you're self-aware enough, you can recognize it better in others and bring them back into the space that you need them to be if their verbal cues are indicating that they're in some other way, whether it's angry, but upset in some way, sad. You can say things like, oh, you sound angry. Perhaps if we shift the discussion a different way, we can lean into a more neutral type of emotion. Listening definitely sounds like an easy thing to do, but there's absolutely a difference between listening while paying attention and with empathy. We can listen, like my children, I've had to practice this with my kids. They're teen daughters, and they, I will say things, they've gotten so used to me listening not very actively to what they've said, that when I have tried to practice this with them, they're like, what are you doing, Mom? And I've had to pause and say, wait, I am practicing active listening skills right here with you guys right now. And they're like, well, I love it when you do that, Mom. You're actually focused on me and you're not busy trying to make dinner and do all the other things at the same time. So it has really been helpful in our relationship to pause and say, how was your day? Instead of, how was your day? Make dinner, make dinner, make dinner. Really to engage for that, normally it's 5 to 10 minutes, and then I can make dinner and the evening goes much smoother and they feel heard, which I've appreciated in my relationship with my kids. So with that was just a lot of information relatively quickly. Of course, I could talk about empathy for a lot longer, but I'm going to turn it over because Emily's going to start moving us into why empathy in dispute resolution. So there you go, Emily.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for all that good information that we as lawyers need to understand as we are either participating in the mediation process or being mediators. So the next real question for us is, we know what this empathy is. Is it important in negotiating and mediating? And you might not be surprised to find out that there's a huge debate about just this topic. Some in the mediation field believe that empathy just has no place when you're talking about bottom line commercial type negotiations, two unrelated parties. Yeah, we can see it with Lynn and her kids, but how does that have anything to do with a landlord-tenant dispute where nobody cares? And I think they're wrong. I think empathy is going to be a key ingredient in mediation, even if we have insurance companies or unrelated parties participating. I think the first thing you need to note about this type of empathy, if you're going to show it as a mediation advocate or as a mediator, is that it has to be genuine. So a lot of times lawyers will give lip service to things, and when they do that, it's pretty obvious they're not being genuine. If you find you're in a perspective where it's hard to be genuine, you really need to stop as a lawyer and determine how you can see this other party's side of things. And that actually will, I think, help you become more objective, a better advocate for your client, and get cases settled that need to be settled. So for lesson number one, be genuine. Try to see the other party's side of things. And as Lynn said, mediation, empathy is really that bridge that is bringing us together. As advocates, we're bridging to the other side. That's what we're trying to do. As mediators, we're bridging to both parties, and we're trying to establish trust with those parties so that we can help them resolve a dispute in a manner that feels right to all of them. Well, and I think a mediator who is actually practicing empathy, I think the number one takeaway would be unlimited business for that mediator. I know when I was practicing, and I practiced for 30 years, especially when I was a young lawyer, if I encountered a mediator that I didn't feel valued my opinion, and it's not about agreeing with somebody, it's just about hearing them, I really wasn't going to revisit that mediator again and again. Because when we as advocates go to a mediator who's going to be neutral, we want to be heard. So I think that empathy really helps us really fine-tune our objectiveness that we need to try to evaluate cases and get them settled. And isn't that what our clients really want? Yes, they want advocates who can put their position out there, but oftentimes they really just want to know, what is it about this case that makes it dangerous? Tell me objectively what's going on. And I think for mediators, empathy helps them to understand each party's position, and with that understanding, moving the parties towards a resolution to meet their needs. This slide that we have pulled up is a really great visual about empathy and how practicing empathy leads to procedural justice for the parties that are participants in mediation. And in other words, the the parties who come to mediation, number one, they want to have their story told, and then they want it heard by someone. They want that done by someone, a mediator who is both fair and impartial. And they want to do that with a mediator that's trustworthy and that shows them respect. And if all of these things are practiced and the participants believe that this mediation process is leading to procedural justice, then they will be satisfied with the process, even if the exact numbers weren't what they thought they would get or what they thought they would pay when they were coming into the process. I think, hearkening back to what I said as a young lawyer, I think the same thing happens between mediators and lawyers. If lawyers don't feel like they are being heard by the mediator, then they are less likely to listen to what the mediator has to say about what they've learned about the other side's position, all that they've learned through empathetic listening. I know you're asking these questions, which would be, how am I going to use empathy in a mediation that's just all about the numbers? And I don't think any dispute is ever just all about the numbers. There's usually some play on understanding the other side and seeing what their position is. And even if the clients no longer have any dealings together, then this use of empathy may be the bridge that you as a lawyer need to build with the other lawyer, so that when you have the next dispute, there will be that trust and respect that you will gain in your next dealings. You might be asking this question, which is, what about insurance companies? Why they don't care about empathy? They care about how much money has to be paid. And that could be true. You may get an adjuster who isn't from Alabama, doesn't care about the parties' relationships or using empathy. You may be a defense lawyer who's been hired by such an insurance company. Well, first off, I want you to always remember that even if the insurance company is retaining you, you do have an actual client. They do still want to be heard. They still want to feel like this process where their insurance company has retained a lawyer, that whole process has been fair to them. They want to be respected and have their side of the story heard as well. I think, though, that when insurance companies are involved, using your empathetic listening skills will really help you objectively evaluate cases, so that if the insurance company only cares about dollars and cents, then you can actually get to the bottom of that by using your empathy skills to get there. And it may allow you to uncover those facts that allow there either to be more money put on the table, or whatever it is that you need to get the dollars and cents where they have to be. But I think really the kicker of what everyone is probably thinking as they came to this seminar, which is, if I show empathy, then I'm just going to be weak. And no one's going to think I'm a great lawyer, because everyone's going to look at me as weak. And I don't think that's the case. I'm going to be perceived as touchy-feely, using a bunch of psychobabble that lawyers don't care about. And I don't think that's the case either. One thing I want you to remember is that as you'll have your goals as you enter any mediation. Just because you have heard and listened actively to the other side so that you understand where they're coming from, it doesn't necessarily mean that you just throw your goals out the window for what you're trying to accomplish in this mediation. So practicing empathy is not something that I think is going to make you look weak or as if you're just giving in to the other side Instead, I think it's a method to try to get to the facts that you need to get that case resolved. What we want to do now is turn to an actual dispute that Virginia Miller and Francis Nolan are going to attempt to negotiate. And you might know both Virginia and Francis, they're both lawyers in the domestic relations field, both very well known in their areas for, I think, empathetic listening and working with others to get matters resolved. I'm going to sort of preview the dispute, and then Francis and Virginia will take it away for us. So Virginia is representing a woman named Dr. Susan Garfield. Dr. Garfield has a billing dispute with John Easer, who owns Easer's Garage, and John and Easer's Garage is being represented by Francis Nolan. What happened in the dispute is that Dr. Garfield took her car, very nice, like a Mercedes, to Easer's Garage because it was running rough. Some repair work was done, and Susan found the bill significantly higher than the original informal estimate. So what does Dr. Garfield do? She angrily approached John Easer. So what does Easer do? He prepared an even higher bill because he was going to show her. Frustrated, Garfield returned to the garage after closing time with her spare key. She drove the car home and didn't pay a cent. Easer then turned to his attorney friend and asked that a formal criminal complaint be filed against Dr. Garfield. Dr. Garfield, who has turned to Virginia Miller, who works at her father's firm, for the purposes of defending her in whatever matter may be brought. So I'm now going to turn it to Virginia and Francis and let them discuss our issue with Dr. Susan Garfield and Easer's Garage.
Well, hello. Hey, Francis. I'm Virginia Miller. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I wanted to apologize the other day. I know that you had tried to call and tried to discuss this on the phone with me, and I had not had an opportunity to speak with my client at that time. And so that's why I said, hey, can we just meet in person? And sometimes too, I think meeting in person is probably helpful for us. And
Yeah, since we don't know each other.
right. And so things don't get lost in translation over the phone, or somebody's busting in your office and there's a weird moment of hesitation. It's not because I'm hesitating about, our conversation.
Right.
So, but I really do appreciate you reaching out to me before this, sort of explodes, becomes chaotic and volcanic, maybe.
Sure.
Particularly, I understand there's been some threats of a criminal complaint and that kind of thing. And so, anyway, so I'm really happy that you reached out to me. Happy to be here today, and just really interested in hearing Mr. Easer's, where he's coming from with this, and interested in hearing his side of this.
Right. Well, and I think that might be demonstrative to you because I'm kind of concerned about him, to be honest. Just in full disclosure, he and I have had a fairly lengthy relationship. And he is pretty well known to me to be a fair and honorable fella. Mm-hmm. And so I was a little bit curious about his reaction to this situation, because having dealt with him for a while, I felt it was a little bit out of character for him. But having talked to him at some length now, I have realized that what we have going on here is a long-standing relationship between our clients. So as I understand it, my client has been lifelong friends with the now deceased uncle of your client.
That's also my understanding.
Yes. And I believe that my client has serviced your client's vehicle since she first learned to drive.
That sounds also correct. Yeah. So start checking. I mean, we're agreeing on some of the facts, some of the basic facts there. Okay.
What may not be known to you is that your client happens to be one of a very small handful, and I mean probably less than 5 of my clients' customers
Mhm.
to whom he extends a pretty significant ongoing discount for his services.
All right. I don't know that I knew that.
Right. So, and it's conceivable that your client has had this discount extended to her for so long that she's not even aware of that fact.
Okay.
So I think my client's sort of explosive reaction had a lot to do with feeling abused, having his generosity toward your client abused in the sense that she would question his bill was very hurtful. I think it really hurt his feelings, to be honest, because he's always tried to be so fair to her, and in fact has always extended a discount to her. Another thing that I probably need to make you aware of, and I don't know how this, if at all, has played into the dynamics we're dealing with now, but my client has been suffering from a back injury. And I believe that on the day your client presented with the car, he was on painkillers and was in the back office and did not do the one-on-one with her that he normally would do.
Sort of the initial consult rundown.
Yeah. And laying out the estimate, that kind of thing. His mechanic, Billy Joe, was running the show that day, and he relies on him pretty heavily, and has successfully. He's a great mechanic. He had not, though, had an opportunity to fully verse him in the mechanics of estimating and communicating that. So that may have contributed to the misunderstanding. I don't know, but it is his report to my client that Dr. Garfield came in with a great deal of urgency to get her car back. And the mechanic was aware of the longstanding relationship between his boss and this client, and wanted to be respectful of that, was also running cover for my client, who was suffering from pain and on painkillers and being instructed not to get up and move around. But as I understand it, when he got into the work, there was more involved than he expected. He tried to call Dr. Garfield and wasn't successful in reaching her. And I believe he felt the pull between wanting to have the car ready at the designated time and also wanting to make sure that she approved of the work. And I think in reliance on the longstanding relationship between his boss and Dr. Garfield, he thought it better to get on with it and make sure that the car was ready on time, which was the course of action that he took, even though he wasn't able to reach her regarding the specifics. But I do believe that he has preserved all the parts and has preserved a map of his work that any mechanic could evaluate to just confirm the legitimacy of what he did and the necessity of what he did, if that would be helpful to Dr. Garfield. Although I think her needing that would be hurtful to my client.
Sure.
I could certainly understand that might be something that she might want
to take a look at.
Right.
Well, it sounds like now that I know what I know, which I'm about to share with you, it sounds like almost sort of that Lemony Snicket's a series of unfortunate events almost.
Okay.
Because I think from my client's standpoint, they have had this long-standing relationship, right? So, I mean, she's used to going in, and I think how we all just kind of get into the thing about, especially with cars, because so many of us don't really know that much. And your car, and you kind of know, you're like, I don't know, but you have this trust and faith in this person. And so I think when she went in initially, that Dr. Garfield was a little bit taken aback. I think she probably felt a little snubbed by because he didn't come, because that's the kind of maybe he has done himself a disservice over the years, because I think he normally, because of that connection, has usually sort of gotten up, come out,
sure,
done the whole royal treatment, said, hey, move over Billy Joe or whoever he might have working.
Gotcha.
And he's been the one to do this because of that connection. And so when she walks in and he doesn't even bother to like say boo, from what I understand. That sort of, I think, set a tone for the Lemony Snicket series of unfortunate events.
Sounds like it, yeah.
That
Well,
I think has ended up with your client, threatening this criminal complaint. So she had no idea about the back injury. And I think probably if he had told her that
makes sense, yeah.
maybe they would have done maybe she would have come back later. Maybe she could have talked to John Easer. I mean, you know, and the other thing is, and getting to the bill, I mean, she is, let me just explain something to you here. She's hot about this bill. I mean,
Right.
she is hot as a firecracker about this thing, because this initially, from what I understand, and I've got some documents here, and you probably have seen the same things. She gave me a copy, but Billy Joe just wrote down on like the back of an envelope. You know, it wasn't like on a invoice with the Easer name or anything like that on it. He didn't sign it. Now, of course, should my client have probably gotten, but again, I think because she done so much work with John Easer, she just trusted, you know,
Sure.
there was a certain sort of, you know, faith and trust. And, you know, he wrote down whatever it was, 1902. And she shows up, and this bill is, you know, $3,000. I mean, do we know what?
Well, as I understand it, what happened was she came in and raised Cain, which I think
She
was
did.
pretty uncharacteristic for their relationship.
It
Again, I
was.
think my client, first of all, I don't think he had considered, okay, I wasn't available to speak to her directly. That may have been offensive to her. That never crossed his mind.
Well, he's on painkillers.
He was
Probably
miserable. He'd given instruction to Billy
Right.
Joe to handle things, so he didn't have to stand because he was under doctor's orders to stay off his feet.
Right.
And so it did not occur to him that had contributed. All he knew was she came in screaming at him. And this, after a lifetime of extending a discount to her, he got so angry and hurt that she was screaming at him that what he did was he took the bill that Billy Joe had presented and he showed her, here's what it should have been if I was charging you what I charged everybody else on the street.
Okay.
And that was the second bill that she was presented.
So was that the 3,000 or the 3,400?
That was the 3,400.
Okay. So when she comes in and she's hot as a firecracker over the 3,000, then he says, okay, let me show you based off of whatever.
At this point, they're both hot.
And
So let's, you and I, because we don't need to engage in that level of misunderstanding.
Sure.
Like, I don't think either of them was acting within character in that moment.
Right. I don't think so either.
Yeah.
I don't, because of such the long standing, I think they kind of said, oh, okay, you want to pour gasoline on it? All right. And then I'll go get the
Well,
match.
she didn't know he was in pain and suffering. And he didn't know that his absence had been received by her as a slight.
Yeah, kind of, it's offensive almost.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and again, I want to give your client the benefit of the doubt that she may have forgotten that she'd gotten a lifetime of discounts.
She probably, I mean, well, I think it's just one of those things. If you're not, if you're not writing on the invoice,
Sure. Yeah. This is what it would have been. This is what we're charging you. Yeah. Yeah.
This is the Garfield family discount or whatever it is.
Right. So
Okay.
the problems that were encountered were not foreseeable in the initial examination of the car. I think that's also an important factor to consider here. And I think that is something that she could have an objective mechanic confirm. There were some rusted bolts that required something like an hour and a half each to be drilled out and replaced. And that's not something that could be seen or known to be true until the work was undertaken.
So you're saying that when Billy Joe, your understanding from your client is that when Billy Joe looked under the hood and gave it his consult, so to speak, he wasn't able to see that those bolts were rusted and that there would then need to be, were new bolts did they have to acquire new bolts?
Right.
And was there also additional time, I suppose?
Like 9 hours of extra
Okay.
time. So
To get
so
those
there
out.
was a lot of time he had not foreseen. And again, remember, we're trying to honor this longstanding relationship by getting the car ready at the promised time
Mhm.
while encountering problems that created the need for a lot more work than was anticipated.
Okay.
So I think there were probably some other particularities that I'm not a mechanic, so I may not be qualified to speak to the specific particulars, but
Right.
I know that was the most time consuming of the unexpected challenges.
Okay.
Now, how is the car running?
As far as I know, it's running great.
Okay, well, at least we don't
She
have
hasn't-
that to worry about.
Yeah, no, that's part of this, that's not part of the complaint, that,
Okay.
that you can't come back and say, oh, that the car is not, that's not a defense that I'm gonna be able to use.
Right.
That the car is not running well, or that anything's wrong with it. I think she's actually happy with the way the car is running. I think it's just a matter of being very confused, as to treatment,
Mm-hmm.
and B, as to the price.
Sure.
And so I guess I think so 2 parts here, or maybe it's just really 1 part, but number 1, how do we, now that everybody's gotten mad at each other, how do we, how and do we want to preserve? I mean, is this a relationship that Mr. Easer even wants to preserve?
I'm pretty sure he will. I think once he comes down off the painkillers, and can realize, I would hope with my assistance, that he has inadvertently caused her to feel slighted. And that is what generated her rage, not the actual servicing of the car, or not necessarily questioning his integrity as a human being, but she didn't get the usual experience. And
Correct.
so that created suspicion.
And then
I
gets
think-
this bill on
yeah,
that, but
I think I can help him to understand that. And I think that you and I have some room to negotiate in terms of what the actual number is that Dr. Garfield could pay to solve the problem, so that no further legal action has to be taken.
Somewhere,
mean,
yeah.
I don't think
And
that.
Francis, can we interrupt you now because of our time limit occurring? Because there was a
Yeah.
great job by both of you all to really listen and talk out this concern. When you look at this problem, you think this is easy. She took the car. She wasn't supposed to. She owed some money on it. But tell us what you gained by listening to the other side. So, Virginia, what did you learn from Francis by actually listening to what had happened?
Oh, most importantly, I learned that the gentleman, my client has got a huge banner bonnet because, he basically ignored her when she walked in, and she's this lifelong family friend and all this. And I think she's been used to being treated like a grand poobah. And I learned that, my gosh, the poor guy's like huddled up in pain in there. I mean, and I think maybe if that had been communicated in some way, my client may have brought him a damn casserole or something, I mean, it would have,
Sure.
she would have probably been like, don't worry about the car right now, bring you a casserole.
Right.
That's from the reading of my facts, that's what I got from it. So that's the first thing that I'm like, oh shoot, this guy's sick. I mean,
Well, and I didn't realize, I think, the fastest thing that I learned was, oh my gosh, you can be in pain and suffering and in your own little universe and conveying messages to other people that were never intended. And I don't think it had ever occurred to my client that he caused offense.
right. That she found that to be offensive.
Which is totally understandable based on their relationship. Yeah.
Any other suggestions, Francis and Virginia, that you can give our audience for how to, and I liked how both of you engaged in this active listening without getting defensive. So how do you do that?
Well, I think this is a practice that I engage in routinely as a lawyer. I think that it's important to remember that my client's facts are not my facts. I was not there. I was not a witness. I don't have any personal knowledge of the information that's presented. So I try as much as I'm able to always qualify my remarks with, it's my understanding from talking to my client that X, Y, Z is the case, rather than presenting myself as simply a separate voice for my client. I mean, the clients can fight it out amongst themselves all day long, and they don't need our help to do that. What they need us to do is be the voice of reason. They need us to remain calm. And to do that, we've got to depersonalize. We've got to stand back from the facts and present them objectively in sort of a neutral fashion, in a way that makes room for the story to be completed by other people's thoughts and insights.
And I don't ever really like, I always like for the other lawyer to go first. I always like to say, I'm super interested in hearing your client's side of the story, because I am super interested, because I'm going to gain a lot of information and be able to fill in a lot of holes. And so when a lawyer starts talking, I like to let them talk. I mean, and gather all this information from them. I don't like to become defensive and like butt in and be like, well, but I don't like to do that. I feel like it breaks it up. And then I like to just gather all my information and then start working from there. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, sometimes when I'm questioning clients, I will say to them, if your wife or your husband was sitting here right now, what would they tell me about these series of events? I get a completely different story then. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating way to uncover another side of the story. But I think everybody who has one reporter in their job, whether you're a counselor, a lawyer, an accountant, you got to be careful, because one reporter is going to have a myopic view of whatever the situation is that they're telling you about. Mm-hmm. We do some collaborative work, and in collaborative work, we actually sit the parties down eyeball to eyeball and watch the way they interact. And that has been so informative to us in seeing how differently stories will come out when people have to look at the person that they're talking about as they're telling a story.
So take us to the next step, which would be, we've gotten all these facts out. How would both of you see this case resolving?
I think we have a lot of room to negotiate between what the actual out-of-pocket cost to my client was and what the by-the-books number of the bill was. And I would like to think that based on the long-standing relationship, these two parties would be persuaded to meet in the middle to preserve the relationship.
Or even my client, I think, was so willing to preserve the relationship. I think she may have been willing. Once, if I had gone back to my client and explained that he was injured and had been hurt and hell, probably needed some money. I mean, based off of that, wasn't able to work as much. I think that there that empathy piece in there could have persuaded my client to probably go up a little more towards that $3,000, maybe somewhere even between the $3,000 and I'm not saying she was going to pay the $3,400, but I think she probably would have gotten closer to that $3,000 number in order to preserve the relationship and sort of show him that she cared.
Good faith. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think he ever expected or wanted to get the $3,400.
Right.
I mean, it would have been a win to him to get the amount that Billy Joe presented on the second bill, which had all kinds of additional discounts to her, by the way.
Yeah.
I failed to mention that.
Right.
Billy Joe himself, out of reverence for the relationship, had extended additional discounts on that bill. So
I think it's a great example of seeing how once Susan Garfield understood what John Easer was going through, that her number may not have been, she might be willing to pay more than she probably originally was when she first communicated with Virginia that she wasn't paying anything.
Right.
Right. Do we have any questions that anybody wants to put into the chat? Our time is almost up and we want to respect everybody's being here with us for their CLE. If Having no questions, any parting words, Virginia and Francis, we'll start with you.
I don't think so. I think we got it all said.
Lynn, would you like to say anything?
All right, as probably the main empath in the group, I would just say that empathy just can build bridges across all relationships in your career, in your home and family, and about everything that you do. So I highly recommend.
I echo Lynn's statements and thank her for all her important research into the psychology of empathy so that we could be the benefit of learning all of that. We thank you for being here. And if you have any questions, feel free to email any of us. We're happy to help. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Emily, Lynn, Virginia, and Francis. Y'all did a great job. And I really do believe that empathy can help build bridges, and whether it's your personal relationships or your professional relationships and in your work. So thank you all so much for sharing this valuable information.